right, so hi everyone. I'm going to get started. It's been up there a while. So 15 minutes, that's the time that I have today to explain the importance of one of the most overlooked things that can help break or make your game when taking it international, localization. So some of you in the audience might already know what localization is, and that's why you're here. So maybe a quick raise of hands. Do you know what localization is? Oh, look at all you experts. Okay. For those of you that don't, there's a couple in the audience. Let me tell you why it matters and why it might matter for the future of your game. Localization is often confused with translation. So for us, for the purpose of today, when I refer to localization, it will be the entire process of adapting a product or content specific to a location or a market. And that can include anything from translation of text, but also cultural nuances, market preferences, altering art assets, following legal requirements, creating new packaging, manuals, or content. So I can also talk about how that might require recording new audio, transforming hardware, cutting out sections of your game. And it basically also involves a lot of like what considerations in terms of markets you can choose for launching your game, right? Think of dialects, regionalities. For those of you, we're in Germany, but you know, if you speak English, you notice right away I'm not British, I'm American, it's very clear. And even when you're speaking on the spectrum of English, you know, you have English for Australia, English for South Africa, Canada, lots of different markets. So I've spent the last 12 years working in the localization industry, and in my experience across a lot of different industries, what I have seen is that localization is often considered an afterthought, and it's left to the last minute, which unfortunately means it's usually rushed and not done well. So if that's what you plan to do, or didn't plan to do and didn't think about it, that's why I would recommend, as the title of my session says, don't translate your game at all if you're not going to do it well. So one of the things we see is that game developers and publishers spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. They can spend months, even years, perfecting their game, designing it, creating it. And then right before they launch into all these markets, they say, ring, ring, hi, Kayla, can you translate my game in 8 days? And I'm like, no, we can't. It would probably be better that you don't do it if you're going to do it so rushed. So today I'm here to give you some insights on how you can nail localization and grow your player base internationally. And I'll get to that in just a minute. There you go, that's a little late. So let me start by showing you, that was also part of that. Let me start by showing you some examples of what can go wrong. So we'll get a little laughter because I'm sure you're all hungry and ready for lunch. We know of some global failures that make the headlines every year. Maybe some of you are familiar if you've been around a long time with gaming. Coors translated turn it loose as suéltate con Coors. So if any of you speak Spanish, you know that can mean like basically get diarrhea. Not a great translation. This one I actually don't think is that horrible. Nothing sucks like Electrolux, but you know, it's play on words, but also not great. Most times in America, sucks means something is not good. When Coca-Cola first translated its name into Chinese, the literal translation was bite the wax tadpole or a stuffed horse with wax. So depending on which dialect. And so you can imagine that didn't go over well. And then they had to spend thousands of dollars and hours looking for over 40,000 characters that phonetically sounded like Coca-Cola, which means happiness in the mouth. And so you can see how even just a small error can dramatically affect a brand. And you know, it's not above us. Like even ginormous companies like Coca-Cola can make these mistakes, right? There's a couple gaming ones I threw in. A Winner Is You. This one's in the Gaming Bad Translation Hall of Fame. And also the X-Men Welcome to Die. So we've all seen these fails. We've posted them. We've forwarded them or shared the memes, you know. And we get a good laugh. And like I mentioned, there's even a Gaming Translation Hall of Fame out there. And it's funny, but it's also not funny if it's your game, right? Because you don't want to end up being on the wrong leaderboard. So having a lack of localization strategy can be detrimental to the brand, especially if it can affect loss of players, you know, negative reviews or scores, or just bad publicity in general. So how do you avoid being on the wrong leaderboard and get on the right one? And how do you take your game global? So before I go in depth on that, I just want to zoom out. I'm falling behind with my slides, sorry. I want to go zoom out a little bit, and so you can see that the opportunities that exist at the moment, right? As most of you probably already know, the gaming market is predicted to hit $200 billion in 2024. And by sheer number, we're looking at Asia Pacific as the largest piece of the pie with 1.6 billion players. It's worth noting that Latin America and the Middle East and Africa are the fastest growing in terms of number of players at the moment. And the main driver for those two areas is the online population growth and the improvement in internet infrastructures. There's a couple slides here that are maybe worth taking pictures. I mean, you also have the slides after. But from App Annie's macro mobile trends last year, you can see that among the top countries, 18 out of 20 are non-English speaking. That graph is very small, but they're non-English speaking, I promise. And so what does this mean for you, right? If you're a game developer or publisher or thinking about launching a game internationally, the world is more global and people are more connected. And so when you launch your game and you want to increase your revenue, your downloads, improve your player experience, you need to think about where those players are at and how they interact with the game. And it was actually really lovely because the pixel art just before me was talking about accessibility, which is also very much tied to what we do. So no matter where you are in your game publishing, development, creation journey, I have 4 considerations that will hold true no matter where you are. So if it's a year from now or 5 years from now, it will probably still be relevant. You can take some notes. I've said it a couple times, but don't leave localization as an afterthought. There's a risk to not considering it early in the development stage, and it basically comes down to costs, quality, and time, right? Give yourself enough time to think about the localization process early, to think about what considerations that means, whether, I mentioned before, cutting out parts of your game, if you're thinking about launching in certain markets. It's very typical that Western games that need to launch in Asia don't consider considerations there, and also vice versa, but especially for legal reasons. If you're looking like Germany, Japan, China, there are things that need to be considered. Also give yourself enough time. I wasn't joking with the 8-day thing, to give you some context. Like a translation team normally can do around 2,000 words a day. So if you have, and you can do QA testing around 8,000 words a day. So if you have like a 3 million word MMO game, like you're talking about months that are required for translation, right? And localization testing. If you have a super hyper casual game, it can be done in a week or 2, but still you need to plan that within your release times. And then you also need to consider yourself for regression testing and bug fixes that can affect other parts of the game. And the challenge is with this that people don't usually can start from an international mindset. They start with like an English-centric or wherever you're from, French, Spanish, German-centric, Japanese-centric game, and then it's an afterthought, right? Okay, now how do I launch this into other markets? And that's where it gets very complicated. So it can't be done in parallel, and it becomes a bottleneck, especially when the developers are delayed, which never happens, right? And then all the time that you planned for localization has cut in half, and you still need to hit that release date because your management team is committed to it publicly or online. For gamescom sometimes. And so a couple of the things that I actually had a meeting this morning, and it's amazing that with someone who was a producer for quite a long time at a large AAA game, don't hard code your text, okay? And don't make words in your art designs, because that means that every time you have to translate into another language, you have to find a way to get the text out or redesign all the artwork. So that's just gonna cost you a lot of money. Allow space for expansion. We're in Germany, so German is one of the known languages for growing between 30 to 35%. So we'll come off of all your text boxes off screen. You won't be able to read anything. Design with global in mind, and consider these adjustments that I mentioned before. And it becomes a cycle, right? Like it's not just one and done. So you have to think every time you add a new release, you create new content, that's going to affect the localization, and you're going to need time to be able to launch that, release that, update that in all the languages. So one of the one of the best practices too is also just think about how you can make everything very easy for internationalization later on. And there's actually some really interesting white papers or guidebooks you can find online for free, like internationalization best practices. They may not be specific for gaming, but they are around for software, for e-commerce, and a lot of that can be very applicable. So you can find best practices like the don't hard code, consider expansion, make sure you're extracting content for language, scripts, characters, date and time, formats. You know, America, those dang Americans with the dates and the months in the wrong order. I can say that. And you have to remember also that like icons, colors are different in different cultures, right? So if you need to swap those out, is that going to be really difficult because it's all embedded into your artwork or your interface design? Don't forget about right to left languages. So, you know, a lot of times games companies will come to us, hey, can you do Arabic for us? And we're like, yeah, we can send it to you, but does your game actually, like, will you actually be able to show it and display it correctly? So those are things just to keep in mind. A case study of this was actually a simple puzzle game that had a great UX, and it had very little copy in the game, so the translation wasn't a big deal. But it kind of picked up in different markets, you know, due to the stream, Twitch, influencers, and they didn't have their app store description or anything localized. So what could have potentially been hundreds of thousands of people that would have adopted their game was cut very short because they weren't agile enough to kind of get that updated quickly. So again, it's not one and done. It becomes part of your cycle, so to keep that in mind. The second piece of advice I would give or consideration around the localization is provide context. Context, context, context. This is another one. I had a meeting yesterday. Don't just work with any translator, right? A translator is not a translator. Like, I speak Spanish, I speak English. I should not translate your game. So, you know, look for people that have gaming experience, that are actually gamers. Give them time to play the game. You know, are you able to give them videos? Are you able to give them recordings? Like, for goodness sakes, give them a screenshot of the game if you don't have anything else so that they can have some context. And then, you know, what I would say is one of the biggest challenges is the lack of context creates a lot of friction. Because once you get it back, you're going to say, well, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't go in line with my character. This is not following my, you know, my game aesthetic. If you have a GDD, a style guide, a character guide, anything about your game, like share that with the people that are going to be working on your localization or translations, because that will make the game better. If you have titles, keywords, names of locations, names of people, names of anything you don't want to translate, if they should be proper pronouns, list those out. And it's basically what we call a localization toolkit or a loc kit. And this is very common practice across the industry. So everything should include a loc kit, and when possible, you have the GDD, you have glossaries, you should say what platforms or consoles it will be played on, and then have a query log. And the query log should be shared with the whole team, production, dev, the translation team, the translators, the localization team. And a really simple index of that can be something like, I think I have it. Nope, I don't. You could have something like green where you put it questions for the developers, you know, yellow when the development or production has confirmed back, and then red, these are like bugs or things that need to be fixed in games. Very simple, but really effective. How am I doing on time? So the next part is, I would say, leveraging existing technology. The beauty of being in 2022 is there's tons of technology out there, right? So don't try to reinvent the wheel. Don't try to do everything manually, copy, paste, exporting Excels. There's tons of technology that can help you save money and get to market faster. So there's a long-time industry tool called Translation Memory, and it's basically a database of all the translations you've done in the past. Why does that matter, Kayla? I don't understand. If you have in-game content, you have marketing content, you have ASO content, you want all of that content to be translated the same, right? So your character names are the same, your ambiances are the same, your terminology is all the same. And so what that means is once you've translated it once, it's going to be saved and stored, and it will be consistent across all the different channels or content that you publish. And that also usually means you're not going to pay for it twice. You pay for it once, and it doesn't matter where it shows up, it will be repopulated. So this is a great tool. It's existed in the market. It's not machine translation. It's existed for like 30 years. Professional translators use it all the time. The second is audio recording in the cloud. So 20 years ago, AAA games would support approximately 500 lines of dialogue, and often it would just be in one language, right? And now it's typical that AAA games are available in 12 to 20 languages, and they can have between 50 to 100,000 lines of dialogue. And a lot of those are voiced over or have, audio recordings. And there's been huge advances in this space in terms of technology that offers cloud-based recording, that allows you to record from home studios, and we saw that with COVID, that was a huge problem, right? Like, we weren't able to travel, people weren't able to go into the studios. So this is a great option that also is existing on the market now that a lot of companies offer, and you can leverage that. It will reduce costs significantly, because one of the largest things in entertainment, film, and recording is traveling to the studios, paying for lodging, for per diems, etc. And there's definitely a revolution happening around voice recording and voice talents, for those of you that maybe don't know. Historically, there was a very, very small pool of people that would record, right? You'd have the professional. It happens a lot here in Germany as well as in Spain, where I'm from. You would have the same people that would record all of the big Hollywood hits, right? And so one of the case studies that I really loved was, an example is, there's a dubbing and voiceover actor named Jordy Brow, and he records for Robin Williams, Tom Hanks, Nicolas Cage, Sean Penn, Dennis Quaid, and Tom Cruise. So imagine trying to get on his calendar and how much he will charge you to record anything. And so while the ability to record rurally is, it's creating more cost effectiveness, it's more talent in rural areas and more access to more people. So it's going to be more affordable and faster time to market. And lastly, test, and test again. LQA, for those of you who don't know, is usually also forgotten and at the last stage of the game localization process. But this focuses on linguistic testing and translation quality, but it also covers UI, UX, evaluation, compliance testing, culturalization, and functional tests sometimes. So what we suggest is the best practice in this space is to work with native linguists who also have experience in gaming, that can play the game or have access to the game once it's been launched, pre-launch, let's say. And they should be testing on all the devices possible. So any device, console, version, and checking that the game is working. And not only will they be able to detect linguistic issues, they'll be able to detect content that doesn't fit in the boxes, like we said with the German, that's not fully visible, that's not working correctly, wonky text, if we're doing different Asian characters or right to left languages that aren't showing up correctly. And this is critical when the perceived quality of your game will most likely affect the retention, right? So we work with a lot of different companies that rush, maybe don't have time to do the testing, they launch anyway, and we've had examples in the past year where they've had devastating results, where 40% of their player base has downloaded their app and stopped playing their game because some release affected everything and they weren't able to play, and then they just said, okay, I'm done. And so this is a pity when you can spend a couple of days working with a few testers and get all of these bugs sorted with your dev team. So one of the case studies, if I have time on this one, one of the case studies on that is a leading mobile game provider, and they have around 200 games. And they realized the importance of testing. And so they had a lot of ebbs and flows where they had an internal testing team, but they realized that when they were launching several games at the same time, or several of those games had lots of issues, they weren't able to manage those ups and downs. And so testing was getting overlooked, and that was an issue, or people were on holidays or sick leave. So they decided to externalize the testing to an outsourced vendor, for example, where they were able to ramp up in 2 weeks. I want 30 testers for next week. I want 10 testers for the week after, and be able to really deal with those fluctuations of the testing requirements that their games were needing. And so this is just a quick recap of everything, the 4 considerations you can keep in mind at a high level when you go back and speak with your dev teams or your project managers. And so the question isn't, what is the ROI or the return on investment for localization? Or how much am I going to pay per word? This is a fun one. The question is, can I succeed in the market without localization? 40% of internet users will not shop on websites that aren't in their native language. 40%. And 64% of internet users said they're willing to pay more if the product is in their native language. So when well done, video game translations can turn a project from a niche title into an international phenomenon. And when done poorly, you can end up in the bad translation Hall of Fame. And so what I would recommend is just all of you, whatever you can do to think about localization early on in your process. And that's why understanding what the process of video game localization entails is critical for publishers who want to increase sales while expanding their reach globally. That's all for me. Do you have any questions? Yes. I think he said there's a microphone so that the people on streaming can hear you. No pressure.
Thank you. Who has the final say in a project like, say a developer goes to a localization team and says, this is what I want translated. The translation comes back and they don't agree or don't like it. Does the translator say, no, this is it, this is your best translation? Or do they say, oh, well, all right, we'll go with yours?
It really depends. So a lot of times the question is if the developers or the publishers have people that speak the native language that can review it. If that's possible, normally best practices would say that person would be involved at the beginning to create the glossary, to create style guides and share that with the team. And then usually it's a process. So like normally you would send the first couple batches, you would have the reviewer check those batches and say they like it or they don't like it. And then really to understand, is it stylistic preferences? Is it, you know, I mean, usually professional translators don't have grammatical errors or spelling mistakes. It can happen, they're human. But usually it's like, oh no, we want it to be expressed more this way, you know, more elfish, more whatever, you know, whatever their ambiance is for the game. So it's more of a teamwork, right? It's more of a team effort. And that's one of the biggest things in localization. If you're not treating the localization team as part of your game team, they're always going to be outside and they're not going to be able to express the game the way you are. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming to my session, and I hope you have a great day.